Today we are going to continue on in our journey through Mark, looking at chapter 6, verses 45 through 56. There's another parallel passage in Matthew chapter 14, if I got that correct. It is probably, as I mentioned, one of my favorite stories, accounts in the Gospels. Because I think it shows so much about us as people. And there's that character, Peter, who oddly enough doesn't show up in Mark, but he shows up in Matthew. Why Mark chose to not include that, I don't know. But we will come to that just because it is part of the story. But we wanted to certainly take a look at Mark chapter 6, verse 45, and highlight that. Now, it is interesting to note that not just this story, and the typical highlight of this story is Peter walking on the water. That's what everyone associates with it. But you know, there's in the world of famous people and famous events, there's often the backstory that not many people know. Let me throw out a few names to you and maybe throw out the odd, maybe interesting tidbit, some of which are exciting, some of which are kind of sad, actually, that are associated with these people. If I said the name Alexander Graham Bell, what do you associate with that? Telephone, of course. Did you realize that when he pitched his idea of the telephone to Western Union back in the day, the chairman said that idea of a telephone is nothing but a toy. It will never ever catch on, and you might as well just throw it away. I'm glad, well, I don't know, am I glad that Alexander Graham Bell didn't do what he said? But he did not, and now the telephone is probably one of the most used devices in the entire world. If I said the name Samuel Morse, what does that mean to you? Samuel, may not as well known. Samuel Morse. Samuel Morse. If I said something, the blank code, I'll bet you recognize that. The Morse code. Made up by Samuel Morse. He actually invented the idea of the telegraph, the single wire telegraph, and to go along with it, the Morse code. And the reason why he came up with it is that when his wife died and he was away from her, he was very distraught. He was upset that it took him several days to find out that his wife passed away. He said, surely there's got to be some way that we can communicate with each other faster than a message on a pony. Certainly, the story behind Samuel Morse. Thomas Edison. Thomas Edison, what was he known for? A light bulb, the first workable light bulb. I think he was one of others who had been working on this, and I think the number was he tried 1,000 or 2,000 different types to be able to come up with the one that actually did work. But did you also know that he invented a voice-driven sewing machine? Did you know that? Didn't take off, but he did invent that as well. How about this? If I said the name Jeff Bezos, what's he known for? Simon?
Richest man in the world.
Richest man in the world. Who, is it a public company? Surely it's got to be. Amazon is sure it's got to be a public company, right? Who knows? I don't know. Certainly he doesn't own it himself. Goodness. Richest man in the world. Did you know that Jeff Bezos' father was a circus unicyclist? He worked in the circus as a unicyclist. The backstory. Benjamin Franklin, who's that? Now, if I was in the States, more people might say, oh, I've heard that name. Okay, Benjamin Franklin. Is anyone aware of that name? Heard that name before? A couple of shaking of the heads. Benjamin Franklin, one of the founding fathers in the United States. One of the stories you often see. I remember as a child in school, he was playing around with electricity. He was the one who sent a kite up during a storm with a key on the end, and experimenting, trying to figure out how electricity works and all those sort of things. He was an inventor of sorts. He invented the swim flippers, or one of the ones that was key in inventing the swim flippers, and is recognized, oddly enough, in the International Swim Hall of Fame. Benjamin Franklin. Last but not least, gentleman by the name of Rudolf Diesel. Invented the what? Invented the Rudolf Diesel. Rudolf Diesel. There we go. Invented the diesel engine. However, as he tried to sell his story and sell his design, sadly, he took his own life in 1913 because he thought, for everything that he tried, that the diesel engine would fail. It would never, ever become popular. All kinds of things that have sort of a main character, a main event, the one that we think about. There's all kinds of backstories. So today, even though the main event, the main thing that people think about was Peter walking on the water, there's all kinds of other things that we're going to be looking at to try and challenge us and encourage us today. So here we go. Here we go. So we're going to be looking at this in Mark chapter 6, verse 45. And let me get there myself. And we're going to have to tie in together some of the things that we've already looked at, because the first thing that we're going to come to is titled Out for a Walk. First thing we're going to come to is the question of again? Again? Notice what it says in verse 45. It says, immediately, and this is after the miracle of Jesus feeding the 5,000. If you remember, have they been out on the water before? Were they out on the water before? Yeah, okay. What was the event of them being out in a boat on the water? The storm. Exactly, the storm. Immediately he says that he made his disciples get into the boat and go out before him to the other side, to Bethsaida, while he sent the multitudes away. And when he had sent them away, he departed to the mountain to pray. And when evening was come, the boat was in the middle of the sea, and he was alone on the land. So here's the question. Here's the question. Where were they? Where were they? Obviously, they were out on the water. Out on the water. Now, you would have thought, after the first instance of being on that boat and in that storm, they would have said, you know what? I've had enough of boats, and I've had enough of storms. I'm not really interested in getting into this boat again, because who knows what could happen again with this storm thing. I find it interesting that when we think about water, all kinds of interesting things in the Bible happen around water. Can you think of an item or a story or two that sort of has water as one of the central themes?
The water turned to wine.
The water turned to wine, absolutely. What else?
Moses.
Noah, absolutely. What else?
Moses.
Moses doing what? Spreading, parting the Red Sea. Very good. Anything else? Baptizing. Good. Simon?
Moses hitting the rock.
Moses hitting the rock and the water coming out. Very good. Anything else?
Ezekiel talks about the rivers.
Ezekiel talking about all kinds of things, all kinds of things. You know, we could go to when Jesus had taken the money out of the fish for the tax. And I know, Steve, when you're down at the fish pond, sometimes you're hoping you could find a few bob in one of those fish. But Jesus did that. All kinds of things happen when we think about water and water events in the story. But you know what? Did they not learn from before? Did they not realize what all could happen in a boat out on the lake? They have to realize most of these were very, very tough, hardened fishermen. And when they got afraid and they were scared in that first event with the storm, you know it must have been quite a serious storm for these tough fishermen who had experienced those things many times before. But I want us to think for a minute, how does this compare? How does this compare to the story before? Let's look at it again really quick. It says, when evening was come, in verse 47, the boat was in the middle of the sea, and he was alone on the land. And we saw them straining at rowing, for the wind was against them. Now about the fourth watch of the night, he came to them, walking on the sea, and would have passed by. We'll stop right there. What were some of the differences? What were some of the similarities between the time when Jesus was there with a boat, and it was the storm and all those sort of things, compared to now? What was the same? What was different? I think one of the things that struck me the most was that in this time, Jesus was not in the boat with them, but he was on the land and he was praying. Jesus wasn't with them. Whereas the first time, Jesus was with them. Can I try to encourage you with something? I wonder how these disciples, how these men felt. And I know they're still trying to figure out who this Jesus person was and how all this worked. But there must have been something of a fear that sort of gripped them when their master wasn't with them in the boat. But can I encourage you with something? Just as we've mentioned before, we've got this little part of Psalm 23 up here. And this has encouraged me and helped me continue on more times than probably anything else. And it says, even though I walk through the darkest valley, I fear no evil, for you are with me. You're with me. And during this month of not being able to gather together, can I encourage you that the Lord is with you. Even though you may not see him in the boat, he is with you. And with Melek, as she is going through the chemotherapy and all these kind of things, and there will be days when she doesn't feel well and she feels like, you know, how long will this continue on? I can encourage her that the Lord Jesus is with you. And for whatever dark days that may come along your path this week, can I encourage you that the Lord is with you? But the Jesus was not physically in the boat with them. And I think that's an important difference. And the Bible says that they were battling against the wind. It says from the evening time, and there's all kinds of debates on how long this was, but it says up until this particular version says, now about the fourth, in verse 48, about the fourth watch of the night, and different versions will translate this differently. But what this would mean, within the Roman time, there had been, they would divide the time up into 4 watches. The fourth watch would be 3 to 6 a.m. 3 in the morning till 6 in the morning. They've been battling that storm, those waves, to try and get that boat across for a long, long time. And sometimes our battles do seem, isn't it true, like a long, long time. And I find it interesting. Notice what it says here. Notice what it says in verse 48. Now about the fourth watch of the night, he came to them, walking on the sea, and would have passed them by. Now, there's some difficulty with that little phrase there. There's all kinds of guesses and debates, and the problem is, wouldn't it be great to know what was happening inside the mind of Jesus? What was his plan? What was he thinking about when this particular thing happened? Mark said that he would have passed them by. Almost like, have you ever been in a car and maybe there's two cars, you're going somewhere and you're driving one car and and this is about when we had our kids in the car or whatever. You're driving one car and you have a friend who's got another car and driving down the motorway. And when one passes the other, what do you do? What do you do? Hey, you wave. How you doing there? And this is some of the guessing that people would say that Jesus would have been doing, that he would have passed them by as he was walking on the water. But I think, as we're going to look at in just a moment, that it was far more than just a simple passing on by to say hello as Jesus walked on by. Because now we're going to come to what we're going to call a curious event. A curious event. Notice what it says. Verse 48 again. And when he saw them straining at rowing, for the wind was against them, now about the fourth watch of the night, he came to them walking on the sea and would have passed them by. Let's read on down to verse 52. And when they saw him walking on the sea, they supposed it was a ghost and cried out. For they all saw him and were troubled. But immediately he talked with them and said to them, Be of good cheer, it is I. Do not be afraid. Then he went up into the boat to them, and the wind ceased. And they were greatly amazed in themselves beyond measure and marveled, for they had not understood about the loaves, because their heart was hardened. There's so much there. But let's think about this curious event just for a moment. Jesus being God, he would have known the amount of struggle that they had against that wind. He would have known that they were rowing, that they were trying to get the boat across the water to the other side. Now, it's quite possible that Jesus could have very easily come in and said, you know what, you've been struggling for your 20, 30 minutes. That's enough. I'll come and solve the problem right now. But for whatever reason, Jesus let them struggle with trying to row that boat and get it to the other side for the number of hours that they did. Now, if I was a disciple in that boat, I probably could be thinking to myself, now wait a minute. Because did you notice what happened? When he got in the boat, what did he do? He calmed the storm. And they could have thought, hey, we've seen this before. Yeah, this is good. But then they could be thinking, I'm wondering, you know what? Jesus, you could have done this 4 or 5 hours ago. Why didn't you? Why didn't you? And I don't know why he didn't. But I'd like to just challenge you and encourage you that, as we've said 1,000 times, that, our timing is often so different than God's timing. We like things instantaneously, right? Don't we? We want instantaneous healings. We want instantaneous money. We want instantaneous ease in our lives. But God is after us growing as believers. God is after us growing in our character. God is after us becoming strong. And in order to become strong, we have to go through those times of waiting and those times of difficulty and those times of saying, I don't feel like putting my one foot in front of the other, but I'm going to do it, trusting that God has a greater plan. And I can imagine those disciples. Now, the Bible doesn't say the Bible does not say anything about them asking Jesus, you were there. The Bible actually says he saw them struggling. He saw them struggling. And if Jesus saw them struggling, that means that he knew what was going on. I can promise you that God looks down and He knows exactly what is going on in your life. He looks down and knows exactly the circumstances that you've got going on. He knows maybe the job struggles. He knows maybe the financial struggles. He knows maybe the health struggles and even the mental struggles during this time of isolation. He knows that. And He's got a plan and a purpose. Jesus had a purpose for the walking by the boat. He had a purpose. And that purpose is getting ready to show itself. So as I said, our job is not to try and figure out the timing or even necessarily to try and figure out the purpose, but to rest in the fact that God does have a purpose, that God does have a plan. Because the end of verse 48 does seem to indicate that Jesus had a purpose in what He was doing. He wasn't out just for a leisurely stroll out on the water with the waves coming up. But He had a greater plan. He had a greater event that He was going to do. And then we come to what we're going to call a curious reaction to go along to the curious event. Notice from verse 49, and let's look at that again. And when they saw Him walking on the sea, wouldn't that have been a strange thing? Wouldn't that have been a strange thing to see somebody walking on the sea? And they did what probably you and I would have done. They thought it was a spirit. They thought it was a ghost of some sort. And they cried out in fear. For they all saw Him and were troubled. But immediately He talked to them, comforted them, and said, "Be of good cheer. It is I. Do not be afraid." So first of all, we need to recognize that as they saw Him, they thought it was a spirit. Now, I checked into that word. It's interesting. That word, let me tell you the word from the original language. And the word is phantasma. Phantasma, from which we get the word phantom. They thought He was a phantom. Now, is anyone a Scooby-Doo fan around here? Anyone watch Scooby-Doo? Oh, one, few. Okay. And you know, the Scooby-Doo was always after the Phantom. Always after the Phantom. And that's when I first saw that, mine went straight to Scooby-Doo. So when they saw this event, when they saw this thing out there on the water, they thought it was a spirit. They were frightened. They didn't know what to do. And the Bible then says that they cried out in fear, which is what makes sense. Which is what you do, which is what Shaggy did, is what Scooby-Doo did all the time. They cried out in fear. Someone did a little investigation, and now I've not done this, I've not checked this out myself, but I can believe it, that the word fear or afraid is in the Bible roughly 360 times. 360 times. And someone made the connection is, well, that's sort of one time per day for something to be afraid of. But God did not call us to have a spirit of fear, but of confidence, of a sound mind. Notice what happens. Notice what happens. Immediately says, the Bible says, when they cried out in fear, what happens? What did Jesus say? Jesus said, hey, listen, be of good cheer. It is I. Do not be afraid. And with that, Jesus gives them that assurance and that confidence. Listen, you don't have to be afraid because I'm here. I'm here. And I'm going to make sure that everything is according to God's plan. And then the Bible in this account says Jesus continues to step into the boat and He calms the water. He calms the water. Now, in the previous account, that was the great big kind of say crescendo. That was the great big event. That was the focus. That was as Jesus was awake, was asleep in that boat, and the disciples woke him up and saying, "Master, don't you care that we're about to perish?" And Jesus then calmed the water with that word of power. It's almost like in this instance, that just happened. Like it wasn't a big deal, because there's something far more important that was happening. Notice what the Bible then says. We're going to look into this, and then we're going to skip over to Matthew chapter 14, and we're going to tie this in with what happened with Peter. Verse 51 says, "Then he went up into the boat to them, and the wind ceased, as we said. And they were greatly amazed in themselves beyond measure, and marveled." Now, wait a minute. Hold on. Why? Why? Had they not seen that before? They did. And it wasn't that long ago. So what does that tell us then about these disciples? They're slow learners, yeah. They're learners. They're taking things bit by bit, and they're struggling over the things, and they're trying to figure out how this works. And, that encourages me as well, because I don't get it quickly. They didn't get it quickly. But notice verse 52. It says, for they had not understood about the loaves. Why is the bread being brought back into this story? Because their hearts were hardened. And I tried to figure out what was going on there. It says that they were astonished. They could not believe what happened. What did not happen, which you would have hoped, when Jesus calmed the water again, that they would have not had a astonished reaction, a shocked reaction, but what kind of reaction would you have hoped for? A reaction of praise? A reaction of worship even? A reaction of, oh, Jesus, we were confident that you could do that. We knew that you've got a plan for us. We knew that you weren't going to allow anything terrible to happen to us. Oh, Jesus, you are becoming more and more. I cannot believe how amazing this is. But they didn't do that. They were astonished. They said, almost like they said before, what kind of person is this? But then it went back to the bread. And I'm trying to think to myself, what is different about that? Why does it say that their hearts were hardened back when they couldn't believe and they were astonished at the bread? All throughout Mark so far, we've seen Jesus who showed that he had power over illness, that Jesus had power over even death, that he had power over demons, to cast out demons. But when Jesus took those few loaves of bread and multiplied them to feed the entire crowd, I think what has happened is that Jesus showed himself not just as a healer, the great physician, not just as someone who has power over demons or even over death, but he showed himself as Creator God. That he could create something. He could create food. And that brought him up to an entirely new level. And I think that Jesus was hoping that these disciples would finally get that he was something far more extraordinary than they ever thought he was. But because the Bible says that their hearts were hardened, that they struggled with understanding all of these things. And I really think that is this role of Jesus as creator was key to this. So how about us? How about us? How do we see Jesus? If we had to go back 2 or 3 weeks and ask ourselves the question, what do we make of Jesus? Do we see him as just a friend? I hope we see him as a friend. Do we see him as God, the one who can heal someone? And do we even see him as someone who has power over death? And that's a great thing. But do we see him as someone who was all the way back in the beginning, was part of the Creator? And Jesus was involved in the creation of all that there is. And that's who our Jesus is. And we need to make much of him. He needs to be elevated in our lives and elevated in our hearts of all the things that he is and all the things that he can do. But we're going to quickly turn to Matthew chapter 14 for just a few minutes. And we're going to sort of bring a cap onto all these things as we are challenged with a few ideas, just a couple of ideas, as a complement to this event in Mark chapter 6. So Matthew chapter 14, we're just going to come into the middle of this. Matthew chapter 14, starting in verse 28, we're going to read just a few verses. This is we're going to come into the part when Jesus says, "It is I, be of good cheer, do not be afraid." Verse 28, and it says, "And Peter answered him." Well, if there's any of the 12 you would think would pipe up and say something, it would be Peter. Peter answered him and said, "Lord, if it is you, command me to come to you on the water." And that's quite a bold request. So he said, "Come." And when Peter had come down out of the boat, he walked on the water to go to Jesus. But when he saw that the wind was boisterous, he was afraid. There's the word afraid again. And beginning to sink, he cried out, saying, "Lord, save me." And immediately Jesus stretched out his hand and caught him and said to him, "O you of little faith, why did you doubt?" And when he got into the boat, the wind ceased, as we saw in Mark chapter 6. Now, I want to notice just a few things about this idea of Peter walking on the water. And I don't even want to think much about the walking on the water. We hear all about that. But I do want to challenge us with a few thoughts here. Number one, that as Jesus was there, challenging everyone to not be afraid, to be of good cheer, it is I, Peter was the only one to respond. He was the only one to respond. The others doubted greatly, to the point of not even saying anything. Peter doubted, but Jesus did not rebuke him for doubting. I love that. Peter said, if it's really you. Now, I would have thought that people would have known Jesus' voice, unless, because of the wind and the waves and the noise, that he really couldn't hear if it was Jesus or not. But Peter doubted. And Jesus did not rebuke him through his doubt, but he challenged him to take that step of faith. And Peter was the only one to take the opportunity to walk on water. And I always wondered to myself how much he debated within himself before he did that. How much did he debate? Did he say, you know what, if I get this wrong, I'm going to be in a lot of trouble, because I'm going to be out of the boat into the water, probably sinking and probably dying. He is saying, I have someone here who's calling me out onto the water. I think it's Jesus, and I'm going to, what's the T word I'm looking for? Trust. I'm going to trust and do what Jesus asked me to do. So Peter steps out of that boat onto the water. And I love that little phrase that someone said, that in order to walk on the water, you got to get out of the boat. Because here's the thing. The boat, even though the storm was there, the boat would have been very comfortable compared to being out on the water. Because in the boat, at least you're in this bit of wood and you weren't sinking, but it would have been comfortable. It was a place of ease. But out on the water, it was risky. But that's where the blessing was. That's where the miracle was. So how about us? How about us? As we look out into the future for our church, God may be speaking to you about something, some ministry maybe, and you may be full of fear, just like Peter. And the question is, are you willing to take the opportunity that God is putting in your hands to step out of the boat of comfort onto that sea of uncertainty, but knowing that Jesus is the one who's calling you to do it. And that's what's important. That's what's important. The other 11 were just observers. They could, when they got home, they could write down in their journal, or they could tweet, or they could put on their Facebook page, "Oh, can you believe it? I saw someone walk on the water today." That's pretty amazing. But Peter, when he got home, he could tweet, he could put on his Facebook page, "You know what? I got to walk on the water." And it was amazing. And Jesus, yes, he said, "Oh, you have little faith." But I love the whole idea. As long as Peter was watching Jesus, he was walking on the water. And a great lesson there, by the way, when he got his eyes off of Jesus onto the wind and the waves, that's when he started to sink. But Jesus didn't say, "Okay, well, you've done it now. It's your fault." And in Peter's little prayer, "Lord, save me," Jesus reached down his hand and lifted him right up. If you ever have a chance to check out a man who's no longer with us, it's a man called, it's a French name, so I'm going to get this incorrect. I'm going to give it a try. His name is R.G. I don't know what R.G. stands for. I always heard him called R.G. Letourneau. R.G. Letourneau. He is a Christian businessman who put God first in his life. And I read a little account of his life. I really need to get the book and really read the whole thing. And he was a believer who put God first, and he, through a lot of difficulties in his early life, and he tried to start a business and nearly failed and nearly went bankrupt and all of these kind of things. But one thing that he kept, he said, "I want to keep God as my number one. I want to give to God." He had to start to support various mission projects when he had a bit of money, but then he ran into trouble. But he said, "You know what? I'm going to keep that as my focus." And throughout all the difficulties, he never let that go. And then something happened. And he started to, instead of doing a certain kind of work, he started to invent all these massive earth-moving machines. And he became one of the richest men in the entire world at that time in history. And him and his wife decided, you know what, we're not going to give God 10%. We're going to give God 90%, and we're going to live on 10%. And he still died a millionaire. And he was one of these who had all kinds of fear in his life, just like Peter, maybe just like us. But he kept his eyes on Jesus, and he was willing to step out of the boat of comfort onto the sea of uncertainty and walk. And that's what made his life exciting.